Since the breakup of Yugoslavia and the founding of Serbia and Montenegro in 1992, which was itself broken up into two separate countries in 2006, just 3 teams have been crowned as top-flight title winners in Serbia. Red Star and Partizan Belgrade, the 2 most successful teams in Serbia and in the former state of Yugoslavia, are 2 of them, having won all but one post-1992 league championship between them, typically by margins as wide as the one this season, which is displayed on your screen now. And the other team, well, the other team is FK Obilic, a football club that was owned and operated by a gangster, paramilitary commander, and infamous war criminal who was once Interpol's most wanted man in the Balkans. I know, even by HITC Sevens standards, it is some introduction. Željko Ražnatović, better known as Arkan, is thought of as a hero to some, a genocidal maniac to others, and as a notorious war criminal to most of the outside world. He was something else, however, during the 1990s, and that was the owner and president of a Serbian football club, who he guided not just from the second division to a first taste of top-flight league football, but actually to winning that top flight, paving the way for famous European nights against the likes of Bayern Munich and Atletico Madrid. On the face of it, FK Obilic's rise was something of a fairy tale. In reality, it is one of the most corrupt, violent, and despicable league titles ever won, masterminded by a man who left a trail of blood behind him wherever he went. The current devastating conflict in Ukraine is frequently talked about as being unprecedented in scale in terms of a conflict in Europe since the end of the Second World War. But the Yugoslav Wars, which were a series of separate but intimately related ethnic conflicts, civil wars, and insurgency movements spanning more than 10 years, claimed the lives of close to 150,000 people and led to more than 4 million people being displaced. Those conflicts shaped and continue to shape almost every aspect of life in the Balkans, and football is certainly no exception. It is the reason why ethnic Kosovar Albanians like Xherdan Shaqiri and Granit Xhaka play for the Swiss national team, why Luka Modric learnt to play football in the car park of a hotel that housed refugees before going on to win a Ballon d'Or, and why someone like former Aston Villa striker Savo Milešević's 102 international appearances saw him represent 3 different national teams. In fact, it is often said that it was actually a game of football that started the Yugoslav Wars and led to the breakup of Yugoslavia. And the protagonist in this video played a decisive role in starting that conflict. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to an affluent district within the Serbian capital of Belgrade, where there lies a football club that was briefly brilliant before being buried alongside their owner. This is the story of FK Obilic, Željko Ražnatović, and Arkan's Tigers. When I say that FK Obilic were only very briefly brilliant, I'm not doing that thing that people on YouTube so often do of exaggerating for effect. In their entire 98 years of existence, Obilic have spent just 9 seasons in the top flight of Serbian football, all of which came during just a single stint from the late 1990s to the mid to late 2000s. Although FK Obilic were not a particularly successful club, competing only in regional leagues, they were a very competitive regional team who attracted a strong following, particularly for games against their bitter rivals and next-door neighbours, FK Sinjalec, whose home ground was located just 200 metres from theirs, and with whom they shared some memorable clashes over the years, attracting crowds in the thousands. I should note, at this stage, that finding relevant photographs at times in this video may prove to be a struggle. So, whilst I will try to provide a visual wonderland for your eyes to feast upon throughout, as I always do, feel free to treat this video as a podcast at times, should you wish to do so, and just, enjoy me talking about a football club run by a war criminal without any visual accompaniment. Having long been a competitive local team, FK Obilic stepped up to the big time in 1982. Or the big time for them at least, as they won promotion to the Serbian First League just one league below the Yugoslav Third League, which was one of a number of regional fourth tiers in Yugoslav football. Promotion 5 years later meant that, in 1987, for the very first time, FK Obilic would be playing against teams throughout the length and breadth of Yugoslavia, though that wouldn't last long through no fault of their own. Following the death of Tito in 1980, who had been president of the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia since 1953, there was a rise in nationalist sentiment throughout much of the region. Yugoslavia, officially the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovenes from 1918 to 1929, was always a slightly uneasy union of different religious and ethnic groups, and was occupied and split up by the Axis powers during World War II. Following World War II, with the Axis defeated, the communist and former resistance leader, Josip Broz, better known as Tito, became the leader of the reformed republic. With Tito at the helm, Yugoslavia's various factions were just about able to coexist through a combination of Tito's nous, economic progress, and state suppression of any and all separatist movements and leaders, often by force. When Tito died, however, aged 87, and Yugoslavia's economy collapsed, the writing was on the wall for the Republic. As Yugoslavia crumbled, our protagonist Arkan flourished. Born into a strict military family, Arkan rebelled, joining a group of gangsters and thieves who operated in Western Europe at the age of 20. Arkan was good at it, crime that is, quickly rising to a position of seniority and becoming renowned for robbing jewelry stores where he would leave a rose at the scene of every one of his heists to put his own signature on the crime. Arkan's renown was such that, eventually, he was contacted by the UDBA, Yugoslavia's secret police. The UDBA weren't interested in Arkan because they wanted to stop him committing crimes in the West. Quite the opposite, in fact. Tito's regime actually made a habit of exporting Yugoslavia's homegrown gangsters to Western Europe, but because he had proved his credentials as a criminal, and they felt that he could be a useful weapon of their own against so-called enemies of the state. I mentioned briefly about Tito's ability to maintain control and suppress any dissent, and one of the ways in which the state of Yugoslavia did that was by hiring noted criminals as contract killers to do their bidding. Reported to have personally killed 5 supposed dissidents, Arkan was one of a number of Yugoslav criminals based in Western Europe who the UDBA gave diplomatic immunity, fake passports, and specialised help to in awkward situations in exchange for carrying out these killings. Arkan was no stranger to getting into some tricky situations, such as when he was arrested in Belgium in 1973 and sentenced to 10 years in prison for robbing a bank, aged only 23. After 5.5 years in prison, Arkan managed to escape, and though he was eventually caught, he carried out 5 more armed robberies in Sweden and in the Netherlands during the few months that he was free. In 1981, Arkan broke free again, this time after someone slipped him a gun, and later, when police in West Germany tried to detain him, the Serbian gangster was shot. His wound wasn't fatal, and it meant that he was detained in a hospital rather than in a prison, where a more relaxed security presence allowed him to escape once again. In 1983, Arkan was arrested for a 4th and final time outside of Yugoslavia, this time in Basel, but he found the Swiss prison system to be the easiest to escape from of the lot, and within a few months, he was back on the streets. It is possible that Arkan is the greatest escape artist since Harry Houdini, capable of breaking free of more prison cells than James Bond through his own wit, intellect, and physical prowess alone. Or, perhaps slightly more likely, he had the support of the state of Yugoslavia by virtue of his close ties to the UDBA. If there was still any doubt about Arkan having caught favour among Yugoslavia's political elite, it wouldn't last long. Following his return to Belgrade in 1983, and a bank being robbed, with the perpetrator leaving behind Arkan's trademark rose, 2 plainclothes police officers turned up at his mother's house asking if she knew where he was. When Arkan's mother called him to let him know that there were 2 men waiting for him at the house, Arkan turned up with a revolver and shot them both. Though he was detained, Within just a couple of days, he had been released without charge. The message was loud and clear. Arkan was untouchable, and that was in large part down to his wealth and connections. By this stage, Arkan ranked pretty high up Interpol's most wanted list, hence why he returned to Belgrade. Back home, the gangster and hitman, who was among the richest men in all of Yugoslavia, opened up his own ice cream parlour and used his vast wealth that he had gained through his various criminal enterprises to start buying up businesses across Belgrade. It didn't take long for Arkan to stumble into the business of football, initially as the leader of an ultras group which he created at Serbia's most successful club, Red Star Belgrade. The rise in nationalist fervour throughout Yugoslavia could often be best felt at football matches and at sporting events. Football has always been highly politicised in the Balkans, as was illustrated by the importance that was put on Yugoslavia knocking the USSR out of the 1952 Olympics, not long after the famous Tito-Stalin split, at a time when there were genuine fears of a Soviet invasion, and Yugoslavia even had to turn to the United States for aid, having been cut off by the USSR. Arkan founded a supporters group named Delj at Red Star in 1989, which is typically translated as meaning heroes in English, though there is no direct translation for the word. The supporters group grew almost as quickly as Yugoslavia's various nationalist movements at the time, and in 1990, the two would come to something of an explosive head. Red Star and Dinamo Zagreb had long been rivals with violent undertones between supporters, but tensions were heightened when the two teams met in May 1990. Croatia, along with most of Yugoslavia, had just held their first parliamentary elections in roughly 50 years, which the nationalists won, bringing an end to half a century of communist rule in Croatia. As Yugoslavia crumbled and nationalists celebrated, almost 20,000 football fans descended on Zagreb, 3,000 of them from the Delj supporters group, led by Arkan, having travelled from Belgrade. Trouble was anticipated, but the riots that ensued were among the largest ever witnessed at a football match anywhere in the world. Fans, and in some cases just militia men who probably had little interest in football in truth, were shot, stabbed, poisoned with tear gas, and eventually dispersed by water cannons. Whilst the Dinamo Red Star riots are often described as having lit the spark that started the Croatian War of Independence, the reality is that that conflict would have happened independent of that match and of those riots, and we ought not get too drawn into hyperbole. Nonetheless, there was a fine line between militias and ultras in football in Yugoslavia at the time, and the game certainly had an enormous societal and emotional impact in Croatia. Young Dinamo Zagreb midfielder Zvonimir Boban, who went on to spend 10 years at AC Milan and is Luka Modric's idol, famously kicked a police officer who he claimed was mistreating a Dinamo fan in the head. When the police came for Boban, members of Dinamo's Bad Blue Boy supporters group formed a defensive ring around him, and Boban became an immediate icon in the minds of Croatian nationalists. Within 5 months of those riots, Arkan founded the Serb Volunteer Guard, sometimes referred to as the SVG, but best known as either the Tigers or Arkan's Tigers. The SVG was originally made up of just 20 members of Arkan and Red Star's Delj supporters group, with a stated aim of acting as a small but elite fighting force that would assist the Yugoslav National Army, also known as the JNA, in their attempts to prevent the breakup of Yugoslavia, which, by this stage, seemed like an inevitability to most observers. Apologies, by the way, for all of the initialisms and acronyms in this video. I will primarily refer to the SVG as the Tigers, so all you need to remember is that the JNA was the Yugoslav National Army. Whilst the JNA was ill-trained, disorganised, and frequently drunk, Arkan's Tigers were extremely disciplined, ruthless, and the consumption of alcohol was strictly prohibited. From an initial cohort of just 20 football hooligans, the Tigers eventually grew to be a roughly 500 to 1,000 person strong paramilitary force which fought and was feared in both Bosnia and in Croatia. and was aided by the alleged conscription of up to 5,000 refugees. Arkan personally led the unit in most of their operations, awarding medals and ranks to his men as an incentive structure, along with looted goods of course. An outspoken critic of refugees, who he labelled as cowards and traitors, along with being outspoken on a slew of other issues, Arkan became immensely popular among a number of ultra-nationalist Serbs, and in 1993, he entered politics. Of course he did. Arkan founded the Party of Serbian Unity, an openly fascist far-right organisation that would outlive him, and the successor of which is still the largest far-right party in Serbia today. Arkan was frequently on television, particularly after the war had ended, making him a very well-known public figure. He was filthy rich, adored by his supporters, and feared by his opponents, many of them Serbs themselves. Throughout the war, in addition to carrying out mass atrocities, Arkan had been developing complex smuggling networks and monopolising the movement of cigarettes and alcohol throughout Serbia with the blessing of Serbian president and his political ally, Slobodan Milosevic, in addition to opening a number of nightclubs and casinos. Some people considered Arkan to be even more powerful than Milosevic, such was his wealth and influence, worth hundreds of millions of dollars by the 1990s. Bob Dylan once stated, "Steal a little and they throw you in jail. Steal a lot and they make you king," in the song Sweetheart Like You. Well, Arkan had done both, and after numerous spells behind bars, now he was the king of his own empire, comprising businesses, trade routes, and his own army. Arkan even found a new sweetheart all of his own in 1995, when he married Željko Ražnatović, better known as Cheka, the most successful Serbian singer and pop star of all time, at a multi-million euro ceremony that was broadcast live across the globe. It seemed as though Arkan had it all, but there was one thing that he wanted that he couldn't get his hands on, and that was Red Star Belgrade, the jewel in the crown of Serbian football that continued to elude Serbia's most notorious jewel thief. Red Star enjoyed their greatest success during a period of great tumult for Serbia and Yugoslavia, winning the European Cup by beating Marseille on penalties in the final in 1991. But like most things in Yugoslavia, the club could not come through the breakup of the Republic and the Yugoslav wars unscathed. The best players from the former state of Yugoslavia departed en masse during the early 1990s, significantly weakening both Red Star and Partizan, who previously had the majority of Serbia's star players. That left a bit of a power vacuum in Serbian football, which would ultimately be filled by gangsters and thieves who took charge of mafia clubs and attempted to achieve success by any means necessary, fueled by their criminal enterprises and funded by stolen loot. FK Obilic was, in many respects, the obvious choice for Arkan. The club is named after Miloš Obilić, a legendary 14th century Serbian knight who was said to have died valiantly in the 1389 Battle of Kosovo, but not before killing the Ottoman Sultan Murad I. Initially, following World War II, Obilic had been pressured into changing their name by the new communist regime, due to the obvious Serbian links. But in 1952, they got their old name back, and over the next few decades, Obilic fans became renowned for embracing the medieval knight as a symbol of Serbia and of Belgrade, leading into certain nationalist tendencies in the more affluent district where the club is based. My apologies for the graphic images there. Arkan will have known FK Obilic well. Their stadium, built at the beginning of the 1950s, lies directly opposite the Belgrade Central Prison, meaning Arkan will have seen it as soon as he had previously been released. Not only did Obilic's backstory lean into Arkan's own politics and public image, the club was on the rise. Having reached the Yugoslav Third League in 1987, as the breakup of Yugoslavia began and the likes of Croatia and Bosnia created their own football leagues, taking Croatian and Bosnian teams with them, several Serbian teams were automatically promoted to fill those gaps. Obilic were one of them, placed in the newly created National Second League for the 1992-93 season, and in the 1994-95 season, they won promotion to the top flight for the very first time and reached their first Yugoslav Cup final, losing to Red Star Belgrade. A year later, Arkan arrived. Although Obilic were technically in the top flight, the first league itself was divided into two separate A and B leagues, and Obilic was still in the B league. During his first season at the helm, Obilic won the B League title and won promotion to the A League, which, in 1997-98, in only Arkan's second season at the club, they managed to win at the very first attempt, finishing 2 points ahead of Red Star and a massive 16 clear of Partizan. If you're thinking, wow, that seems like a pretty sensational rise, almost suspiciously impressive in fact, then you're not wrong, and your suspicions are well placed. Obilic's run of 47 consecutive games without tasting defeat in a league fixture, which is one of the longest unbeaten streaks in the history of European football, did not come about by virtue of technical or tactical brilliance alone. Arkan was one of the most feared and powerful men in Serbia, meaning that his presence alone at Obilic might have been enough to influence some opposition players and referees, but he wasn't about to leave it to chance. When asked about his recipe for success at Obilic, Arkan once said, "Order, hard work, and discipline. That's my recipe," joking that, "I brought unknown non-league players and turned them into real warriors. They are well paid, I fulfill all of my promises, and yes, I've heard rumours of doping, and you know what? That's true. They eat bacon and garlic before every match." End quote. What jolly good banter. But in all seriousness, Arkan did once threaten a referee by visiting him at half-time and pointing a pistol to his head, which, you know, isn't really within the so-called spirit of the game, is it? The gangster, politician and warlord repeatedly threatened opponents with violence, once supposedly having told the former Real Madrid striker, Prika Onjenovic, "Yo, kid, be careful what you do. Don't make me take care of your knees with a machine gun." End quote. One former star player, who played for a rival team, told 442 magazine that Arkan's men had locked him in a garage for the duration of his team's game against Obilic to prevent him from playing. Over the course of Arkan's brief stint at Obilic, the club's roughly 4,000 fans were also gradually replaced by veterans from Arkan's militia, who were armed and who chanted threats from the terraces and would occasionally point pistols at opposing players during games, which you'd have to imagine was quite distracting for them, if nothing else. So bacon, garlic, and systematic intimidation and violence might have been a better description of Arkan's famous recipe for success in Serbian football. And I'm not entirely sure how much of an impact the bacon and garlic actually had. Unsurprisingly though, it worked. Obilic were crowned as Serbian champions in 1997-98, and they also reached their second Yugoslav Cup final, this time losing to Partizan Belgrade. Arkan was also accused of match fixing, notably in collusion with Partizan, who some claim Obilic agreed to let them win the Yugoslav Cup in return for Partizan letting Obilic beat them in the league, in a game that was crucial to Obilic beating Red Star Belgrade to the league title. Whilst Obilic's success was clearly not won legitimately, at the same time, their team did obviously improve as a result of Arkan's wealth and investment. In Europe, Obilic drew at home to Bayern Munich in the Champions League and beat Atletico Madrid 1-0 in the UEFA Cup, though they still lost both of those ties after losing 4-0 and 2-0 in the return legs. Obilic gave a decent account of themselves in both of those ties, but evidently, bribing and threatening opponents and referees was a bit trickier for Arkan in Munich and in Madrid than it had been in Vojvodina and in Belgrade. In fact, Arkan wasn't even allowed into Germany to witness his team take on Bayern Munich since he was still on Interpol's most wanted list. And the following season, UEFA threatened to ban Obilic from their competitions due to their ownership status. Because of that, Arkan stepped aside in 1999 and transferred control of the club over to his wife Svetlana. Football's governing bodies are notoriously easily pleased by gangsters, crooks, and despots, and that transfer of assets to Arkan's own wife was apparently enough to satisfy UEFA. The following season, Obilic finished as top-flight runners-up during Svetlana's very brief spell as club president, when some spectators at the Obilic Stadium turned up just as much to see the nation's favourite pop star pitchside in high heels as they did to witness an artificially inflated football club that was just about ready to burst. In March 1999, NATO intervened in the Kosovo War and began bombing Yugoslavia, having already intervened in Bosnia 4 years earlier. That led to the football season in Serbia being suspended, and it also greatly increased the probability of Arkan having to stand trial for war crimes of genocide or massacre against the Bosnian Muslim population, crimes against humanity, and grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, all of which he had been indicted of by the United Nations in September 1997. Arkan gave several interviews with foreign reporters after the NATO intervention and bombing campaign began, denying all of the charges that had been made against him. During the same month that NATO began bombing Yugoslavia, Arkan was also indicted by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia for crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention, and for violations of the laws of war, most of which related to Arkan and his Tigers' treatment of Bosniak Muslims, who the UN body accused him of having carried out mass executions of, killing up to 65 Bosniaks at a time, in addition to detaining and housing many in such poor conditions that they died without ever having to be shot, typically due to the lack of ventilation and overcrowding in an extremely confined setting. Arkan would never stand trial for his crimes though. On January 15, 2000, whilst Arkan was filling out a betting slip in the Intercontinental Hotel in Belgrade, sat alongside two friends, reportedly betting on the results of Premier League games, a gunman came up behind him and rapidly opened fire on Arkan and on his security team. Arkan was shot in the left eye and immediately lapsed into a coma. His bodyguard carried him out of the hotel and threw him in the back of his car, but en route to the hospital, Arkan died in Svetlana's arms, aged 47. The assassin, Dobrisav Gavric, a 23-year-old junior police officer, was also shot in the melee, sustaining life-threatening injuries, which he survived, but which also left him with permanent difficulties walking. Gavric pleaded innocent in court, but was sentenced to 19 years in prison for the murder. However, shortly afterwards, the Supreme Court overturned the District Court's ruling in the case due to a lack of evidence and the vagueness of the initial trial. Gavric and his accomplices went back on trial, and in 2006, at their second trial, they were found guilty again and each sentenced to 30 years in prison. Whilst Gavric was the man found guilty of killing Arkan, his motivation for doing so and who, if anyone, put him up to the task still remains unknown. Arkan was not a man lacking in enemies. He had political opponents, grieving family and friends of those who he had killed or had ordered to be killed, and even enemies within football. The last of those three may sound the least likely to lead to his death, but within the space of just a few years, as gangsters flocked into Serbian football, several club owners, directors, and presidents were killed. Around 10,000 people attended Arkan's funeral, including some of the most famous faces in Serbian music, culture, and sport, and the entire FK Obilic first team. Whilst Arkan's death had been sudden, with just minutes separating the bullet that had penetrated his left eye and his heart beating for the very last time, Obilic's death would be much longer and drawn out. Although the fear factor had gone, Obilic still finished third in 2001, before dropping to fourth in 2002, seventh in 2003, and sixth in 2004. In August 2001, around 18 months after Arkan's death, Obilic travelled to England for a game against Hull City, which they drew 1-1. And yes, if you thought that you had managed to avoid a Hull City reference in this video, I am afraid that you were mistaken. During Arkan's time at Obilic, he had carried out plenty of work on the Obilic Stadium, erecting 2 new stands and building a panoramic glass lounge for VIPs. had he survived, Arkan planned to knock down the entire stadium and rebuild it, with a capacity of over 16,000. Unfortunately, the work that Arkan had done on the ground had been carried out without permission, obviously, leading to constant legal battles following his death surrounding whether the new stands had to be demolished. The stadium itself is also rather controversial because it was built, at the start of the 1950s, on a site where German soldiers were executed en masse during World War II, and it is believed that the remains of around 700 SS volunteer soldiers are buried under the stadium's south stand. Svetlana was later convicted of embezzling money out of the football club and sentenced to 18 months under house arrest and fined 1.5 million euros. Without even Arkan's widow, Obilic's collapse stepped up a notch. In 2006, the club was relegated from Serbia's top flight, and by 2012, following a series of consecutive relegations, Obilic found themselves in the all-amateur 8th tier of Serbian football. Since 2015, Obilic have not even entered a league or played any competitive football whatsoever. On the face of it, you would say that the club no longer exists. But they haven't actually ceased trading as a company, they just don't play any football. Obilic's women's team has outlived the men's, meanwhile, Obilic still collects a small amount of revenue by renting out the Obilic Stadium to football clubs across Belgrade. In 2021, having fallen into a state of disrepair, renovation was carried out at the Obilic Stadium with the intention of creating a suitable surface and playing venue to create a youth team carrying the club's name. In 2024, Obilic will turn 100 years old, and a small group of dedicated local supporters are determined not to let the occasion pass without any celebration, with whispers of the return of a first team having persisted over the last few years. One of Arkan's Tigers, Borislav Pelovic, replaced him as leader of the Party of Serbian Unity, which later became the Serbian Radical Party, unsuccessfully running for president in 2002 and in 2004, but successfully getting elected to the National Assembly of Serbia in 2007 and 2008 before his death in 2018. Another of Arkan's Tigers, Milorad Ulimek, went on to assassinate the Serbian president, Zoran Đinđić, in 2003, having already assassinated the former Serbian president, Ivan Stambolic, allegedly on the orders of Slobodan Milosevic, who many organised crime leaders remained loyal to. Whilst Arkan died before he could stand trial, Milosevic did stand trial for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in The Hague, but died of a heart attack in 2006 before the trial could be concluded. Whilst the Yugoslav wars officially ended in 2001, tensions in certain parts of the region remain high, and fears of a potential return to some kind of conflict persist. Serbia still does not recognise Kosovo, which officially declared independence in 2008, as an independent state, with tensions flaring up at the border in 2021. Only one member of Arkan's Tigers, despite the litany of charges that faced Arkan himself at the time of his death, have actually been convicted of crimes relating to their time with the Tigers. At the Obilic Stadium, there is still a portrait of Arkan outside the ground, along with a banner commemorating the team's sole Serbian championship in 1998. If ever a league title deserved an asterisk next to it, it is surely that one. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if that was the case. It is absolutely free. Leave a comment if you feel so inclined, and obviously, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media, on either Twitter or Instagram via the username at HITC Sevens on both. Again, should you wish to do so. I'm not Arkan, I'm not going to force you into it or anything. Just, if you feel like it,